Good morning, everyone, to the Tuesday morning Bible study. It is Tuesday, November the 30th, last day of the 11th month of 2021. Tomorrow, we begin December. Oh, wow. It's just hard to, where is this year gone? All right. Well, let's get started. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 41. Genesis 41. Last week I knew folks, I suspected or knew that folks would not, most folks would not be able to join us last week. So and in fact, my folks, of course, my mother was here, but Carol joined us briefly, and we decided to call it off and do it and resume when most of the group was here. All right. Okay, so Genesis 41, and we are where we left off last time were the dreams of the two prisoners that Joseph knew in the prison, and it went well with one of them, and it went very badly with the other. And then we learned today, with the beginning of chapter 41, that 2 years have passed. Joseph is still in prison, and but he is about to be sprung. Okay. Bill, could you mute? I think there's some sound, or either Bill or Lois, one. I think there's some stray sound that's coming through. Okay. Great. All right. So chapter 41, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. All right, so let's get started. Let's read, let's just read a little bit. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the banks of the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. In the morning, his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer, remember him, the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly, and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. The thin and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I fell asleep a second time, and I saw in my dream 7 ears of grain, full and good, growing on one stalk, and 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouting after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. But when I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. All right, well, let's take a break. Let's take a break there. Actually, yeah, let's take a break there. What observations or thoughts do you have about this so far? Awfully nice of that cupbearer to finally remember, huh? Joseph's been in prison for 2 years by at this point, and the cupbearer, who remember in the previous chapter that Joseph had said to the cupbearer, please, when you go free, when it happens as I have said it's going to happen, please remember me to Pharaoh. Please say to Pharaoh, hey, there was this guy that I know who had interpreted my dream. Why don't you let him out? Why don't you speak favorably of me? And in chapter 41, it explicitly said that the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. But here he is, as in verse 9, I remember my faults today. And as I remember what I had forgotten to say.
It's a continuation of 7 being a very important number in the Bible.
Yeah, definitely.
7 always plays a major role in the Old Testament.
Yeah. It's a number. The number usually means something along the lines of completeness, perfection, completeness, and perfect in the sense of complete. And for example, like a full cycle. So like we speak of 7 years in the 7 years having to do with the Sabbath and the cancellation of debts and things like that. Forgiving 7 times. When Peter asked Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive my brother who sins against me? 7 times. The idea being that 7 is a full cycle. It's a complete. It's like a week. A week. It's like a full cycle. And that's completion. That's perfect in that sense. Later on, and now kind of along those same lines, later on when Jesus says a line that is often mistranslated, when Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's a mistranslation. And the people who translate it that way ought to know better, because that's not because when we hear the word perfection, we're thinking, like never crossing the line and all that. What Jesus is actually saying is be complete. Be complete as your Father in heaven is complete. Be whole is the idea there. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. That doesn't really directly relate to this passage, but I did want to say that with reference to the number 7.
Joseph knows that God will interpret the dream for him, but he also says, interestingly enough, he already knows that God's going to give a favorable answer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed that too, and I don't know that I have a good explanation of it.
Talking to the boss, you make big promises.
Right. Well, and even then, even then the content of the dream is not so much itself favorable as much as it can be turned into something favorable. In other words, it doesn't have to, it's not actually a pretty picture that Joseph is going to paint. But having the knowledge allows for the possibility of wisdom being applied and yielding a favorable result.
Well, if you think that God speaks to you through dreams, and I happen to believe that, then anything that you hear is going to be favorable in some way or another. It's going to work. It is going to work for good rather than ill, in other words. The mere knowledge
of what the dream means gives you an opportunity.
Right.
And so in that sense, certainly it is favorable.
Yeah.
Even if what you learn, may make you squirm or, may make you uncomfortable or whatever.
Right.
But yeah. And certainly, as we're going to see, this is not going to be a happy interpretation. It's actually looking ahead to a dark time in Egypt. But the mere fact that they know that means that Joseph then can apply his wisdom, apply his intelligence and his wisdom and foresight to make the best out of a bad situation. And as we'll see, ultimately make for some even further surprising good results.
The scrawny cows won, but they didn't achieve anything by winning. They didn't grow.
They didn't grow, right? Yeah. And Pharaoh, it's funny you bring that up, because then Pharaoh, as he's telling the dream, notice how he's telling it. Compare, just think about this for a moment. Compare his retelling of the dream versus the narrator's description of the dream. How do they compare? Just take a look at the two places. The narrator narrates the dreams that Pharaoh has, and then compare that to how Pharaoh retells them, or tells the dreams to Joseph.
He says, never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt, when he's telling about what the dream is.
Sure. I guess along those lines, what he's doing, he's adding some, there's some editorial license here. He's adding some extra feeling, adding his personal reactions and feelings to to what otherwise might be just a description, just kind of a cold description of what happened. He's adding his feelings about what he saw. So before it's just, the ugly and thin cows ate up the seven sleek and fat cows. Just the narrator kind of leaves it at that. And then Pharaoh, when he recounts it, does say, as you said, came up after them, poor, very ugly, stressing just how ugly they are. In fact, they are so ugly, they're the ugliest things I've ever seen. And it's just funny, he felt the need to underscore that. You have no idea just how ugly these things actually were. And then, of course, when I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. Now it goes without saying, it's suggested by everything that's here. There was actually a class of people in ancient Egypt who did this sort of thing, who interpreted dreams, who interpreted omens. They were called magicians, It's kind of related to the priestly class. Not exactly the same, but somewhat related. And they specialized in esoteric lore, secret knowledge. They interpreted omens. They tried to foretell the future. They were sort of the supernatural wing of the CIA. You know, you can imagine that. That's what they represented in the Egyptian court.
We call them psychiatrists.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, in a way they were. In a way they were. They were. They were an ancient. Yeah, they were sort of an ancient counterpart.
Yeah.
Sort of an ancient counterpart of what today we might think of as a dream interpreter or a therapist. Someone who kind of looks into the soul. They look into the soul and they can help unpack things that are there.
I'm surprised Joseph didn't say, and Pharaoh, tell me how that made you feel.
And what now, Pharaoh, what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly.
But he said that wait a minute, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer.
Right.
Not unfavorable, not going against what you think, but a favorable answer.
Yeah, well, and that's what we were just chatting about that a second ago, that what he's about to tell Pharaoh is favorable in the sense that it is foreknowledge of events to come. That what I am about to tell you, Pharaoh, is going to be helpful to you. It's going to be helpful knowledge. It's not necessarily going to be happy news, but it is going to. But the knowledge of it, the foreknowledge of it, is going to help you to plan, to apply wisdom to the situation in such a way that you're going, with that knowledge, you're going to make the best, or you can make the best out of what may be a really tough situation. And the rest of this book is kind of a testament to the truth of what Joseph is doing with Pharaoh here. Because it's not only going to be good for the land of Egypt, but it's also going to lead to some unexpected good results, some unforeseeable good that touches Joseph very personally, as we will see. All right. Okay, well, let's see. I will say too that while this talking about this class of magicians was something that you had in the Egyptian court, these there were such people, there were such counterparts in Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Babylonian civilization. Certainly later in the Persian Empire, you had people like this. Okay. All right. Oh, and just we don't need to look these up, but I'll just say that for some examples of counterparts, just on your own time, you might want to look at Esther chapter 6. There's my mom and dad. Might want to look at Esther 6 and Daniel chapter 2. Okay. Particularly Daniel chapter 2, because that's the text where Nebuchadnezzar sees the handwriting on the wall, and he's struggling to come up with what that means, what the handwriting on the wall means. And just as with Joseph in Egypt, in the book of Daniel, Daniel is the great teller of fortunes and dream interpreter and so forth. Hello, Mom.
Hey, honey, sorry we're late.
Oh, no problem. No problem. We'll talk later, but I hope everything went well with your appointment.
Good. It went well.
Good, good. Okay, so let's let us read on. Let's start at verse 25. Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. All right, let's pause there. All right, so what thoughts do you have on Joseph's interpretation and what he says that follows?
Not only interpreted the dream, he came up with a recommendation, which is what the boss usually wants. Is don't tell me my problems, tell me how to solve them. So
That's right.
it shows exceptional wisdom.
It does.
This is a minor thing. I don't know how they laid up produce back then. They couldn't save it very long, but
Uh,
yeah,
right.
grain, you could store grain, all right.
Yeah.
You could dry fruit back then, but storing produce is probably very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. He as you say, he provides a recommendation. He actually recommends the creation and filling of a particular job, one that he conveniently is the perfect person for. His time has come. The job description that he is providing is one that he is perfectly prepared to fulfill. Quite perfectly. Of course, he's right. It's not just a purely self-serving thing. He is correct in his diagnosis and his prescription. All right, what else here? Actually, the really good stuff happens next. So why don't we just actually push ahead and read from verse 37. All right. In fact, let's read from verse 37 to the end of the chapter, and we can discuss what's there. All right. So from verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it. It was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship in all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. The 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt then came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you do. And since the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world. All right.
Joseph's come a long way.
Yes, he has. Yes, he has. He has come a very long way. Now this is there's a good bit here that is certainly worth lifting up. What are some things that you notice along the way here?
Well, they gave him the daughter of a priest for a wife. I think that's probably significant. You know, not just anybody in the royal court. They gave him the daughter of a priest.
Yeah. Very high standing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting also that I don't know, I guess maybe there were other trades other than farming, but in the midst of a famine, he sold the grain to the Egyptians. He did not pay for it. How they paid for it in the midst of a famine.
Yeah. It's not said in such a way as to suggest oppression. I mean, it's not related in such a way as to suggest that what Joseph was doing was perceived as onerous or or bad. But that is an interesting detail. I why he just doesn't just give it to them. Right.
And they had enough to sell to the world, which is, now the world wasn't very big, but still, that's amazing that they had enough to feed their own people and then sell it to the world.
Sure.
It must have done very well during the 7 years of plenty.
It's a testimony to Joseph's foresight.
Yeah.
It's certainly a testimony to his foresight, his very, very smart planning, so that the whole 7 years of plenty were not just about eating as much as you can and spending all the money you can, but but storing up for those years that aren't going to be nearly as good as these ones now. And so that they would be ready. Now, of course, this business, the way chapter 41 ends, is what then sets the stage for the rest of the story. Because, if it weren't for that little detail about how the whole world was in need of food, this story might just end with Joseph, living out his life in Egypt, fat and happy, raising a big family, and the story just end there. What it does is it creates the conditions for us to see Joseph's family back in the land of Canaan re-enter the story, because the famine reaches where they are, and Egypt is where the answers are. And so Joseph's family, which, as far as he knows, he's completely cut off from that family. But in God's view, from God's point of view, Joseph's family back in the land of Canaan is now affected by the very thing that Joseph received insight about. And so now they are going to be, as we'll see in chapter 42, coming to the land of Egypt for relief, for famine relief. And then that of course, is going to, one thing leads to another, and we'll see how it all pans out. One detail that I want you to absolutely not miss is verse 42. What happens when Pharaoh, I'm sorry, Bill has to leave. Okay. All right, Bill, we'll watch the video. Okay. You'll see in verse 42 where Pharaoh says to Joseph, he says, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck, like a necklace. He is being reinvested with clothing, with jewelry. He's being reinvested. He is being given a new identity. In a way, a new family. Okay. What has been taken from him before, okay, when his coat of many colors was stripped off him by his brothers, he was stripped, in a way, literally stripped of his identity. And then, of course, in the story where he's running away from Potiphar's wife, she runs away and she's holding on, and his garment is left in her hand. It's the idea that he's about to lose his freedom. He's about to lose what freedom he does have with that change of clothing. Well, now he's getting new clothes. And these clothes are clothes of authority, clothes that show, as Phyllis put it very well, his complete change of condition, his extraordinary rise. And now he's set over all the land of Egypt with his ring, with his new clothes. You will recall, and I've said this before, but it's important that we remember from the New Testament, remember the parable of the prodigal son, when the son comes home and he's hungry, he's destitute, he's lost everything. And, almost the first thing that happens is the father says, put a ring on his finger, put shoes on his feet, bring him fresh clothes. Because he's been he's been cut off from the family. Now, in this case, he did it to himself. Wasn't so much done to him, he did it himself. But the fact remains, he was cut off from the family. But now, in coming home, he is reinvested with the family ring, with clothes that give him his identity, his true place and identity back. He is restored. I keep coming back to this again and again, but I think it's so important that when Jesus there's so many parables that Jesus tells, where I really do believe that as Jesus thought of we don't know what was going on in Jesus's mind, if he planned these parables before he told them, or if he, or they just came out of him. Either way, you have to believe, you have to know that he is informed, that some of his parables, some of the building blocks of his parables come from these stories that would have been a part of his own life from an early age, would have been part of his own life. Kind of the Bible stories that you're told when you're a kid, they become part of you. They become part of the way you see the world. Well, same way, Jesus told these Bible stories. And among these stories, some of the most famous stories that Jesus would have been told as a young Jewish boy, as a young precocious Jewish boy, he would have been told stories about Joseph, not his father, but Joseph in Egypt and being sold into slavery, and just that whole narrative would have been part of Jesus's early growing up. And so little pieces of that story, it's not surprising then that little pieces of that story then kind of find new forms of expression in his teaching, in his parables, so forth. So good stuff here.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I answered my own while I was listening to you. Potiphar, I thought, all right, is this in relation to Potiphar? But my notes down here say it's a fuller form of Potiphar, but it's a different person. So
yeah.
This is not. And my other question is, and this is just my ignorance, do they really grow corn in Egypt? I mean, like today, are they growing corn there?
I don't know. I don't know. I do not know.
Somehow that's just not a grain I would put in the Middle East, but I don't.
No, I hear you. I think of it as a Native American thing.
Yes, that's what
maybe it's a variety, or something a little different, or not just really corn.
I hear you. I don't have a good answer for that. I do have a good answer though for a question you raised last time.
Oh, good. Which was what? I forgot.
About eunuchs.
Oh, eunuch. Yes, eunuch.
Yes. You raised a question about eunuchs, and you're like, wait a minute. Now, if a eunuch is really a eunuch, how is he married? How does he have, a family? This kind of business. Originally, the term eunuch referred to a court functionary, to somebody who functioned in the court, dedicated member of the court, and did not refer to surgery. It did not refer to certain things that might happen to you. That practice came to be adopted in various places, sort of enforcing. It was it sort of enforced that person's dedication to their duty, removed certain kinds of distractions and whatnot. But that originally it was not about that. It was about function. And so in its original sense, that's clearly what's being referred to here, is that it was just somebody who was a dedicated servant of the Pharaoh.
Well, I have a
fantastic
question.
though. Fantastic question.
I have a question about Joseph. You know, when the robe and all the things that were given. I mean, in his mind, is he thinking? It says that it made him forget about his past troubles. But do you think in his mind, him saying exactly what Phyllis said, he's come a long way? Is he thinking that himself? Of course, he didn't know what was going to happen, that the brothers were going to come and all that. But I mean, do you think he's thinking about, you know, I lost all this and I'm now regaining all this?
Yeah, I think, I think that as we'll see, when his brothers come, I don't think that's something that he foresaw. I don't think that he could ever have I don't think he would have predicted that. I don't think I certainly don't think he saw it coming. And when it does happen, he's deeply moved and surprised by the whole thing. And it causes him to revisit feelings that he had not felt in a long time, or that he thought he had gotten past, you know, because as we'll see, he's going to be very he's going to have, there's going to be a little bit of vindictiveness is too strong, but he doesn't want his brothers to just go scot-free. Okay. I mean, there's forgiveness to be had, but it's gonna come at a little bit of a cost. It's gonna come at a little bit of a cost first, and it also reawakens his passionate desire to see his father, again, and to see his younger brother Benjamin. Because of course we know that he is going to have a special relationship with his younger brother Benjamin, since the two of them, Joseph and Benjamin, are full brothers. You know, he's half brothers to everybody else. But Benjamin, his younger brother, is his full brother, being sons of Jacob and Rachel. Okay. And he has a special desire to see Benjamin and a special desire to see Jacob. And so that's going to be big. But there's no reason to think that Joseph foresaw any of this, that he really had reached a point, at this point, he really had reached a point where the past was behind him. You know, in his own mind and heart, he had made his peace with his separation from his birth family. He had a new identity in Egypt, effectively as an Egyptian, though worshiping God, the God of his ancestors, but still an Egyptian identity. And of course, that's not good enough for God. Okay. I mean, it's good that Joseph has reached this kind of peace, but it's also true that God has more in store for him than just that. That there is going to ultimately be a kind of peace and reconciliation with his past. Now, as I said, the next chapter, it does provide the opportunity for the brothers of Joseph's family, to come back into the picture. And so we'll see all of that next week. One thing I want to start to leave you with today, just for your consideration, and it's very timely, is to consider for a moment how the Gospel of Matthew is written, with the figure of Joseph in the back, or Genesis Joseph in the background of the story of Joseph to be the husband of Mary. Okay. One thing I've been working on here recently is the Gospel's birth stories of Jesus, and considering the very, very significant differences, both in detail and in focus, between the Gospel of Matthew's approach to the birth story of Jesus, and the Gospel of Luke. They're very different details. I mean, there are a few places in which they're flatly inconsistent with each other. They just don't agree with each other. But that's mostly a function of the fact that they have very, very different priorities. Each narrative in each of those Gospels has very different priorities. They're answering different kinds of questions. In this Bible study, not long before many of you joined by Zoom, but we have studied the Gospel of Matthew before with Friendship Presbyterian Church Bible Study on Tuesday. And we saw that when we did that, we saw that the Gospel of Matthew is pretty much entirely concerned with the question of how Jesus fulfills the Jewish story, how he fills he checks off all the boxes to be the Messiah. He really is in himself the fulfillment of all hope, of all Jewish hopes, all Jewish aspirations, that he is the Messiah, that he is the new lawgiver. He is, in a sense, the new Moses. And there are other ways in which his story is presented in such a way that not only does he recapitulate aspects of Moses's story, but the gospel narrative itself also recapitulates certain aspects of the Joseph story in Genesis. And I would call your attention to the first chapter of Matthew. We don't need to open to it, but I'll just say that as we get closer to Christmas, take a read of the first chapter of Matthew, and notice how dreams function in the unfolding of that story. Once you get past, certainly anyway, once you get past the genealogy at the beginning. Okay, once you get past.
May I ask a dumb question?
Sure.
If Jesus ticked off all the boxes of the Jewish prophecy and why do they not accept him as the Messiah?
Oh, okay. The shortest answer, there's a lot to it. The shortest answer is that Jesus dying on a cross. Jesus dying on a cross, Jesus dying at all, okay, but especially dying on a cross, was, from the mainstream Jewish point of view in the first century, essentially disqualifying. It was essentially a disqualifying fact. Has nothing to do with how first century, the majority of first century Jews felt about Jesus. First century peasant, the vast majority of first century Jews living in Galilee and Judea would have been very enthusiastic about Jesus, would have been very happy about Jesus. there's no group of people that could have been rooting for Jesus more than them, hoping that he would succeed, hoping that he would be the Messiah. Okay. And the only thing that Jesus did wrong from the vast majority point of view, the only thing he did wrong was get killed.
And that was the thing that ticked the box for us, the resurrection.
Well, as it would turn out, yeah, as the Christian proclamation would be, there would be the proclamation of resurrection. And that would be, in early Christian proclamation, the resurrection was the answer to the objection. Jesus was a wonderful, wonderful man, but he can't be the Messiah because he died.
Yes, but he rose.
He rose, and so that's the response. That's the response. Now, guess what? Belief in the resurrection. Well, that's an extra leap. Okay, that's an extra leap of faith. That's an extra leap of faith, and it was frankly something that literally no one, including the first disciples of Jesus, saw coming. Literally no one saw it coming. And so for it to be proclaimed was novel. It was different. And it was not something that anyone should just expect everybody to jump on board with, and so, but yeah, I mean, the first century Galilean Jew, Judean Jew, big fan of Jesus, very much hoping he would succeed. And the only thing that went wrong was that he got killed, which disqualified him, because messiahs don't get killed. Okay, messiahs don't die that way. They succeed, they don't get executed. And that was the great problem. So then later, when the Apostle Paul talks about Jesus being the cross of Christ, the cross being a stumbling block for Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, that's what he's talking about. That the cross of Christ is literally, it is a stumbling block, because it's like the one thing that, we really, really like Jesus, but it's the one thing we can't quite get over. He died. That's a stumbling block for us. We can't get past that. As much as we like him, as much as we were rooting for him, we can't get past that. He died. He did not succeed. But of course, Paul takes that and says, well, yeah, it's true he died, but he was raised, and his death actually was for a lot more than you realize. That it had implications, meanings that you're not seeing. And that was essentially Paul's message. But yeah, that's kind of if you can imagine it, that's the short answer.
That was a good answer. Thank you.
That's the short answer to your question. There's a lot. There's a whole semester-long course that could be taught on just that one question, and how Judaism and Christianity kind of started to break apart in especially in the latter half of the first century. Because originally, you will remember that originally the early Jewish disciples of Jesus continued going to the synagogue. I mean, they continued, going to Saturday services. They continued going to the temple. They did not regard themselves as anything but good Jews, who happened to believe that Jesus was the expected Messiah. but in all other ways understood themselves. They did not understand themselves as the forerunners of a new religion or anything like that. That was the process by which Christianity broke off from Judaism. That's something that happened a little later. And the Apostle Paul had his role in that. He certainly had his role in that occurring. But yeah, the original disciples, Jewish disciples of Jesus, did not regard themselves as practitioners of a new religion or anything. Now, let me say one final thing, and then we'll pray and we'll wind down and pray. Whether what Paul did is viewed positively or negatively, I mean, the contribution that Paul made, whether you view that positively or negatively, really is a matter of perspective. I mean, because there were, was what Jesus represented and what Paul represented exactly the same thing? I don't know. I mean, that's a complicated question. And there's a lot to be said about what Paul added to the equation that made things, that led to Judaism and Christianity splitting ways. That said, it is certainly true, in my view anyway, it is certainly true that whatever you think of Paul, positive or negative, whatever you think of Paul, that it is because of Paul that absolutely anyone today has heard of Jesus. If it were not for Paul, no one would know anything about Jesus. Would have long ago been forgotten. I mean, you would no more have heard of Jesus than you would have heard of some obscure Jewish rebel prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. Historians with PhDs in ancient Near Eastern history have heard of them, but ordinary people have never heard of some of these people. And Jesus would be like one of those. He'd be a footnote. He'd be a tiny footnote.
Well, I think that's an odd statement to make, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
And this is unusual for me to say this, but you were sort of negating God's plan and Jesus's
No,
I would outright Paul was probably part of God's plan.
Well, that's exactly
the knowledge
what I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'd say.
But it seems like without Paul, God might have found another way. Now,
I mean, I hear you.
It's kind of weird to say we never would have heard of Jesus if Jesus actually was the Son of God, and I would think, God would find a way.
It is, in history, it was through the instrumentality of Paul and Paul's.
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah.
That anyone today has heard of Jesus, and that fact does not take away from some of the problematic questions that Paul's work raises for the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Those issues are still there, even if we do acknowledge that God used Paul in a very important way to fulfill his plan. There are significant ways in which Paul's gospel, and he often referred to it as his gospel. Well, why did he do that? Why did he say his gospel? Well, it's because there were other people's gospels too. There was James's gospel. there was Peter's gospel. There were versions of the gospel according to like the Jerusalem church that differed in some very important ways from Paul's gospel. And before you say, but they're really all the same, it was just a matter of perspective. Well, Paul got bent out of shape enough about James's gospel. Okay. He got bent out of shape enough about James's gospel that he spends about the first 2 chapters of his epistle to the Galatians complaining about them. And talking about, if anybody comes to you and proclaims a gospel other than the one that we've proclaimed to you, let them be accursed. Let's be clear about who Paul's talking about there. He's talking about disciples of James in the Jerusalem church, who was still urging circumcision on all new converts. And we think of Paul as the standard, sort of the standard of true Christianity. Well, that's true because Paul was the one who won. He was the one whose version survived and thrived. We don't often think about, who were in some of these great controversies of the past, who were some of the losers? Who were some of the ones whose ideas in the conflict over ideas, theological debate, who won out and who lost? And in the way the historical process worked out, the ones that Paul was arguing against lost, not just because of the quality of their ideas necessarily, but also because of the way historical events panned out. We can talk a lot about how the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, had a fatal effect on the Jerusalem, on the insisting on circumcision party within the early Christian church. The effect that the destruction of Jerusalem had on the viability of that church. It really undercut it tremendously. And just that event itself in many ways sort of favored Paul's approach. And Paul then was the one who essentially gave the Christian church the oxygen that it needed, because it was his version of the faith was one that was open to Gentiles, that did not place any, from his point of view, unnecessary or unhelpful barriers to becoming part of the Jesus community. He was the one then that gave oxygen to the movement enough to keep it going through some of those really, really dark times around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and afterwards. That he gave it the oxygen to survive and ultimately to thrive. And for more on that, consult my Rise of Christianity course for Ali and SEL. So. All right. Okay. Well, I know we've got to wrap up, but this has been a fun session today. Next week we are going to be picking up at chapter 42, and I think we're going to be picking up at chapter 42, and I think we're more or less going to be going a chapter a week for the rest of the book until we get to about a chapter. Yeah, it'll be about a chapter a week. So so we'll do that. So we'll be wrapping up Genesis here probably around the end of January. And then, and as we get a little closer to that, we can consider if we want to continue meeting in this format and whatever, and what book we might pursue afterwards. But all those questions are for another day. All right. Okay. Well, let's close with prayer. and then we will be on our way. Oh God, we give you thanks for this day and for this opportunity to gather in this way as we do each week. We pray that you open up our hearts to the lessons that you would teach us in this season of Advent. As we look ahead to the birth of your Son in a Bethlehem manger, we pray that you help us to see the lessons that are still so profoundly true for us today, and what the birth of Christ under the circumstances of his birth, what they mean for us, and the challenge that they pose to us. We pray for each member. I pray for each member of this group, those who are not with us today too. We pray for all who are struggling with any kind of trouble, any sickness, any medical condition, anything at all. We pray for your healing Holy Spirit to be powerfully present in their lives. And now be with us as we go from this meeting, and we face the rest of our week, and bring us back here together again next week. We pray all these things now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. All right, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Sandy, I'm glad you were able to join us for the whole thing.
Cecil's here too, so.
Oh, good. Well, hey, Cecil. All right. I'm holding you in the light as well. So, okay. Well, y'all have a
Tom, Cecil wants to say something.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes.
Hey, did somebody ask a while ago about Egypt growing corn?
Yes. Yeah, Lois did.
They do, and they have for 5,000 years.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thank you, Cecil.
You know what? Now that you say that, I wonder if corn was one of those things that actually we were thinking of it as a new world thing that people didn't discover until they got here. That it may actually have been the other way around. That it wasn't something that grew in America, but it was something that was actually brought over.
Yeah.
By Europeans and then kind of took off.
Right. Yeah.
Like horses. You didn't have horses in North America.
Pigs too, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, that literally almost every horse there is in America is ultimately a descendant of horses brought over by Spanish conquistadors, or something, so
Right.
anyway.
Yeah.
All right.
I thought all along that it was the Native Americans that had learned how to make corn,
Yeah, it was, you do think of that as a sort of a Native American thing.
Went to Egypt?
Yeah. But yeah. Okay. Well, y'all have a great rest of the day, and I will talk to y'all later. I'll see you next week.
Okay. Thank
Bye,
you.
thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Okay.
Hey.